So, for the past several weeks, we have been journeying with God's people through the book of Exodus on this story of God's liberation. We saw the way that God used women, unlikely people in this setting, to begin this work of liberation, to be key players in it. We saw Moses called in the desert and the way that liberation begins with action. We saw incredible works of faith as Moses led the people out of Egypt through insurmountable barriers. We saw this uncomfortable transition time between slavery and in the midst of a journey towards liberation, and how that requires decision making and deciding what it is we want this new community to be about. And so today, we're all the way to Exodus 20, where God establishes a new covenant with the people, a covenant that's meant to set them apart and to define who they are as a people. Because when God sets people free, it's not just an absence of the former conflict, of the former oppression. It's also a liberation towards something new, towards a new community. God didn't merely lift the oppression and the slavery of the Egyptians off the Hebrew people and keep them in place. God brought them out and sent them on a journey towards something new. Liberated community means living together in a new way. It means putting aside the old ways of being together and deciding on what is going to define this new community. How is this new community going to continue to practice liberation? What are going to be the defining traits of it that continue to bring about God's flourishing, the fulfillment of God's promise? And this Mosaic covenant that we see being handed down in this well-known, maybe well-loved story in Exodus 20 is exactly that. It's a way for the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, to be together in a new way as a liberated community, not continuing to live under Pharaoh's laws, not continuing to live as if they were still in Egypt, but to live in an entirely new, God-focused, covenantal way. Now, the word covenant really just is a word that means promise. It's a serious promise. And the covenant in this case is between God and the people and God, and the people together. In our tradition, we talk about baptism as a covenant. We talk about marriage as a covenant. In our LYDN groups, those groups are establishing covenants amongst themselves. They're a promise and an agreement of a way of life that goes beyond just a handshake or a piece of paper. It's something more than that. It's a spiritual assent. And so God establishes this covenant to lead the Hebrew people into a new way of being together, and thus we have the 10 Commandments. Now, my mom reminded me this week that for a lot of people, the 10 Commandments maybe have been misused in their lives. They maybe have been a tool of telling people to get in line, or to shut down dissent, or to shut down debate. Rather than being a tool of bringing about liberated community, they may have been a tool of reinforcement of oppression. And so I want us to look at these 10 covenantal guidelines, these 10 commandments, and see them as a way that God is establishing something totally new, something totally different, that actually still has applicability for us today. So instead of interpreting these in a historical context, I want to interpret them in a way that they can speak into our lives, a modern understanding of how we can relate and put into practice these 10 commandments. Now, I think in general, you can divide these commandments into 2 or 3 categories. You can say that some of them are about loving God and some are about loving our neighbor. And maybe there's a little category that's kind of both right there in the middle. So the first three, commandments 1 through 3, that you will have no other gods, that you will not make a graven image, that you'll not worship idols, and that you won't take the Lord's name in vain, all three of those are about our relationship with God. All three of those are about God's place in our lives and in this new community. The first one tells us that God must be the utmost authority. The way of God, the promise of God, the vision of God, the flourishing that God intends for us has to be our primary expectation of how we will live together in community. It won't be the economy. It won't be tradition. It won't be the rules that were passed down to us from our parents or the way we've always done it. It won't be any other interest other than God. God will be our authority. God will be the highest and the utmost. We won't make anything else our authority. We won't make anything else above and higher than God and the things God wants for us. Similar to that, we won't create an idol of God. Now, in the historical context, you can understand that there were other religions in the area that did worship a particular graven image, a particular idol of their god or many gods. And for us, we maybe don't relate to that so much. But we certainly are at risk of making other things an idol. We're at risk of putting God in a box that's too narrow, a box that's defined by our ideologies, or our tradition, or our desires, or our agendas, or our theology. And so we have to always understand that God is bigger than any sort of fixed thing. If we want to have this covenantal relationship, if we want God's love and mercy and grace and desire for us to be the thing that defines us, then we have to always be open to the idea that God is bigger than we can imagine, that God is mysterious, that God is going to always be revealing something new to us. We can't make something fixed and believe that we have all of it locked down and understood. We have to believe God is freer and bigger than all of that, and we have to always be seeking that understanding. The third commandment is that you shouldn't take the Lord's name in vain. Now, growing up, I probably, like many of you, always heard that was really just about saying, using the Lord's name as a swear. And I never really understood why that was so bad. And someone in youth group at some point explained to me that if you said God's name and you didn't really mean it, that God would show up. And did you really want to be calling God down when you didn't mean it, when you were actually in the midst of sin? Now, that makes God sound like a faulty version of an Amazon Echo or Dot. Like God's not a great version of Alexa and doesn't know when we're really talking to God. And so I don't think that's what taking the Lord's name in vain means at all. What taking the Lord's name in vain means is using the authority that God gives us to speak God's name, invoking the will and the image and the idea of God for things that have nothing to do with God at all, for things that, in fact, maybe are going to be contrary to God's desire for us, this flourishing and inclusive and abundant community that we're creating. When we use God for cheap political stunts, when we use God to harm and condemn others, when we use God to exclude rather than include, when we use God to oppress rather than liberate, when we use God in ways that are not loving of God and not loving of neighbor, that's taking the Lord's name in vain. And so to avoid doing that, we have to always keep our eye on that first commandment, that God is bigger than us, that God is God, that God is mysterious and can't be nailed down. We have to be seeking God's will and this flourishing community rather than conforming God to our desires. We can't mix it up. We can't get it backwards. So this next section of commandments, commandments 4 and 5, these are the ones that I think maybe fall in both category of loving God and living with God and loving neighbor and living with neighbor. I think they're both. The first one is about continuing to practice the Sabbath. That's number 4. And number 5 is about honoring your father and mother or caring for your ancestors. Now, the reason that I think that actually falls in both of those is because I think both of those ultimately relate to caring for the earth. The earth is mentioned in the description of what happens with those commandments. And the earth belongs to God. And so we have to remember to love God through our care of the earth. We have to remember to let ourselves rest as creatures who are part of the earth, to let others rest as creatures who are part of the earth. We have to remember that our time here is finite, that we too, even if we are in the prime of our lives, we too will grow old and need caring for. We have to understand ourselves as part of a circle, as part of a cycle of life. And understand that we are part of that continuum and community of care. But besides that, besides the way that we are connected to God's creation, both of these commandments also remind us that we have to value ourselves and value other people aside from their work, aside from what they can produce and do and make and earn. When we are taking rest, we're not earning, we're not laboring. We're resting in the fact that God is the source and provision of all, and we're allowing others to have that same rest. When we care for and honor our father and mother, especially as they age, we're recognizing that their lives still have value even if they are not working and laboring and working the field and earning. We're being reminded that people are more than what they do. And that in this new community, in this liberated community, we have to keep that in mind about all people. Finally, we get to the last section, the section that is about how we love and live with others. And these are the ones that probably for a lot of us good church people seem pretty easy and seem pretty common sense. Don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't take things that aren't yours, don't lie, and don't covet. All of these things that we should not do. It's not just the action themselves, but it's the way that they break trust. It's the way that they break relationship and prevent the community from leaning on itself. Prevents us from being able to care for another. It starts to walk us into dehumanizing other people. In order to kill someone, we have to forget that they are a life beloved of God. We have to be willing to break the relationship of another to commit adultery. We have to not care about the need of another to steal. We have to value ourselves in getting what we want more than the truth in order to lie. And when we covet after something, we're not able to keep in mind, first and foremost, the care of the community because we're more concerned about our own wants. And so these last 5 commandments, even though they seem simple, they're really a bigger reminder. They're a reminder that we are interconnected, that we have to care not for ourselves first, but for others first, and for the relationships that allow us to care for one another. The work of liberation, it doesn't stop at the Red Sea. It doesn't stop in the desert. The work of liberation continues on into the establishing of a new community, a community that's founded on God's principles of abundance and caring for one another, of loving God and loving neighbor. And in this promise of new community, Christians are invited into that work too. And we're told by Jesus himself that the two most important commandments are just that we love God and that we love our neighbor as ourselves. And in order to do that, we have to keep our minds fixed on the community that God is establishing. And we have to keep ourselves fixed on the idea of love and care in tangible, concrete ways for those who are part of that community with us.